Everyone's talking about the glutes. Every coach, every fitness influencer, every analyst who watched Jutta Leerdam shatter the Olympic record in Milano Cortina and decided they had cracked the code in a single slow-motion clip. The glutes. That's the answer. Big muscle, big power, simple math. But here's the question nobody's asking. If raw hip power were the actual variable, why can't athletes who match her weight room numbers replicate what she does on ice? Why does removing ground friction and asking someone to sustain deep flexion for over a minute expose every weakness in a system they thought was bulletproof? Because the question was never about the biggest muscle. It was always about the system that wastes the least energy. And today, we are going to find out exactly where that system lives. I'm Sebastian, physical therapist and performance analyst, and this is the Injury Breakdown. On the 9th of February 2026, at the Milano Cortina Winter Olympics, Jutta Leerdam crossed the finish line of the 1,000-meter speed skating event in 1 minute 12.31 seconds. A new Olympic record. Her teammate Femke Kok took silver just 28 hundredths behind her, meaning the Netherlands produced a historic 1-2 finish. Both skaters breaking the previous Olympic record in consecutive pairs. Miho Takagi of Japan, the defending champion and the very athlete who had set that previous record in Beijing 2022, finished with the bronze. For Leerdam, this was the completion of a deeply personal journey. She had stood on that same Olympic podium 4 years earlier in Beijing, but in second place. Milano Cortina was the redemption. The tears after crossing the finish line said everything words could not. But understanding why she won, really why, requires going far deeper than the highlight reel. Before we get into the physiology, let's establish why this sport is so brutally unforgiving. The 1,000 meters in speed skating is approximately 1 minute and 13 seconds of near maximal output. The margins between medals at Olympic level are measured in hundredths of a second, margins that have barely shifted across decades of training evolution and equipment innovation. And here is a detail that reframes everything. In 1998, at the Nagano Winter Olympics, Dutch speed skaters dismantled world records across nearly every distance in a single games. Not because they trained differently, because they adopted the clap skate, a blade with a toe hinge that allows the ankle to fully extend through to the push phase, rather than lifting the heel prematurely. One mechanical change. Multiple world records destroyed. That is how sensitive this sport is to force transmission efficiency. And that story, from Nagano to Milano Cortina, is exactly what this video is about. The ice itself changes the rules completely. On a running track, the surface is your partner. Every foot strike generates elastic return. The ground pushes back. On ice, you get nothing. Near zero friction means near zero energy return from the surface. Every joule of force that reaches the blade must travel there from your body cleanly without leakage, or it vanishes as wasted motion. The primary force vector is also not vertical. It is lateral and horizontal. You are not bouncing upward. You are pushing outward, sideways, transmitting momentum across the ice in a direction that requires a completely different coordination pattern from any land-based sport. Add to this a sustained posture in deep hip and knee flexion, sometimes approaching 90 degrees at the knee, and you have an event that is simultaneously a power sport, an endurance sport, and a mechanical efficiency test. All at once, for over a minute. Now let's talk energy systems, because the 1,000 meters is not a pure power event, and this distinction matters enormously. The first 10 to 15 seconds run primarily on ATP and phosphocreatine, your body's emergency reserves. Think of it as a credit card that spends instantly but has a brutally small limit. After that, the glycolytic system takes over, producing energy rapidly but generating lactate as a byproduct. Hydrogen ions accumulate. Muscle pH drops. Contractile velocity decreases. Neural drive becomes harder to maintain. The athlete who reaches the final 200 meters with the least mechanical degradation, not the most power, the least degradation, wins. In Milano Cortina, Leerdam's final split was decisive, not because she produced a surge of raw power at the end, because her mechanics held together when others began to fall apart. And that is where the glute-centric narrative quietly collapses. The glute is not the enemy here. Let's be fair. The gluteus maximus drives hip extension, contributes to each power stroke, and stabilizes the pelvis under load. Without elite glute function, you are not competing at this level. But there is a fundamental difference between force production and force transmission. You can fire the most powerful hip extensor in the sport and still lose that energy at every downstream joint before it reaches the blade. Maximum strength and mechanical efficiency are not the same variable. An athlete with a tighter, more efficient kinetic chain will consistently outperform a stronger athlete with poor distal stiffness. The bottleneck is not the hip. The bottleneck is every joint between the hip and the ice. This is where the real performance story lives. Musculotendinous stiffness. And before you skip ahead, stay with me, because this concept is worth understanding precisely. Your muscles and tendons are springs. A stiff spring transmits force rapidly and completely. A loose spring absorbs it and returns it inefficiently. The ankle and Achilles complex is the critical stiffness zone in speed skating. During the power phase of each stroke, the soleus, the deep calf muscle beneath the gastrocnemius, think of it as the structural foundation of your lower leg, contracts hard and barely changes length. It works almost isometrically, like a rigid support column. And the Achilles tendon in this context is not a bouncing spring. It is a high-tension transmission cable carrying force from the hip and knee directly to the blade. When that cable is stiff and well-tuned, the force arrives. When fatigue degrades ankle stiffness and the joint collapses into excessive dorsiflexion, when the column buckles, force leaks through soft tissue rather than transmitting through the skeleton. Contact time increases, velocity drops, and on ice, unlike on a running track, there is no elastic return from the surface to compensate. Reduced ankle stiffness equals direct, immediate, non-negotiable performance loss. This is the variable no one discusses when they post clips of Leerdam's hip mechanics. This is also exactly what the clapskate solved mechanically in 1998. And what Leerdam's neuromuscular system does biologically in 2026. Moving up the chain to the knee. The sustained deep flexion posture, held across most of the race, places the quadriceps under enormous load with almost no change in joint angle during each power stroke. This is isometric work. The muscle contracts maximally against a load that does not move, like pushing a wall that refuses to give. Isometric fatigue accumulates differently from dynamic fatigue, and is particularly difficult to recover from mid-race. And alongside the quads, the adductors, the inner thigh muscles most athletes undertrain, serve as primary lateral stabilizers, controlling the center of mass with every stroke cycle, preventing the pelvis from collapsing sideways, and destroying the vectoral efficiency of the push. Now add the aerodynamic conflict. The low compressed posture that reduces drag simultaneously restricts respiratory mechanics, increases lumbar shear stress, and compounds every isometric demand already described. The athlete is choosing physiological compromise for aerodynamic gain. The performance equation depends entirely on how well they manage that compromise without their mechanics deteriorating across 70+ seconds of maximum effort. In a race decided by 0.28 of a second between gold and silver, between two Dutch athletes who train the same system, the difference came down to exactly that capacity. Here is what the fitness industry gets fundamentally wrong. Visible hypertrophy and functional performance capacity are related, but they are not the same thing. A muscle that photographs powerfully is not automatically a muscle that is well-coordinated, well-timed, and operating within an energy-efficient kinetic chain. The simplification of elite performance to a single headline muscle strips away everything that actually matters. Intermuscular coordination, the precise sequencing of dozens of structures in timed concert. Force transfer efficiency, the degree to which proximal power survives its journey to the peripheral contact point. And kinetic chain integrity, the absence of energy leakage at every joint in the system. The bottleneck is never the biggest muscle. It is always the weakest link in the transmission chain. Leerdam does not win because she generates more force at the hip than her competitors. She wins because more of that force reaches the blade, and because under accumulating metabolic fatigue, in the final 30 seconds when everyone's system starts to degrade, hers degrades less. Takagi, the defending Olympic champion and world-class athlete, experienced exactly that degradation in Milano Cortina. Not a failure of power, a failure of sustained transmission efficiency under a full race's worth of metabolic stress. So what does this mean for how you train? First, prioritize ankle stiffness, not just ankle mobility. There is a critical difference between a flexible ankle and a mechanically competent one. Sustained isometric soleus loading, contracting under resistance at various ankle angles without movement, is dramatically underrepresented in most training programs. You need your Achilles to function as a transmission cable, not a shock absorber. Second, spend real time holding deep flexion positions under load, not a squat you cycle through in 2 seconds. A position you stabilize, that your neuromuscular system learns to sustain under accumulated fatigue without structural collapse. Third, include resisted lateral force application in your training. Vertical pressing and squatting will not transfer to lateral power production with any efficiency if you have never specifically trained it. And finally, train your adductors for functional lateral stability, not aesthetics. Control of the center of mass in the frontal plane is where positional efficiency lives in any sport involving lateral force application. The core question for every exercise should not be how much force can I produce. It should be how much of the force I produce actually reaches the point of contact. Jutta Leerdam broke an Olympic record in Milano Cortina, not because she was the strongest woman on the ice. She broke it because she was the most efficient system on the ice. Her ankle complex held under conditions where others collapsed. Her isometric endurance in deep flexion allowed her to sustain mechanical precision when physiology was actively working against her. Her kinetic chain was integrated end-to-end, from the hip to the blade, with minimal energy leakage, for over a minute, at the highest level of competition on the planet. The myth says train the biggest muscle and get faster. The science says find every point in the system where energy leaks, eliminate the leak, and the speed takes care of itself. 4 years ago, she stood on the podium in Beijing with silver. This year, she stood on it in Milano Cortina with gold and a new Olympic record. The difference between those two moments was not a bigger glute. It was a more complete system. Performance is not a function of the most visible component. It is a function of the system that loses the least energy. And if that reframes how you think about training, good. That is exactly what sports science is supposed to do. Drop your take in the comments. I want to know what you think the real limiting variable is in your sport. I will be reading every response. See you in the next breakdown.